In the fall of 2021, a small team of scientists published 7 pages in the journal Science that quietly broke one of the oldest rules in North American archaeology. Buried in the gypsum flats of White Sands, New Mexico, on the dry bed of a lake that vanished at the end of the last ice age, they had found footprints, human footprints. A woman or a young person walking with a toddler, setting the child down, picking it up again, walking on. And when they dated the seeds pressed into the mud beside those prints, the number that came back was 21,000 to 23,000 years old. For a century, American archaeology had operated on a simple, almost sacred boundary. Nobody walked this continent before about 13,000 years ago. That boundary had a name, it had defenders, and it had already survived 100 years of people trying to knock it down. White Sands did not knock politely, and the strange part is not that the science was new. The strange part is that for as long as anyone has been listening, the descendants of the people who might have made those prints have been saying, in their own way, that they were already here. Today we are going to walk that lakeshore footprint by footprint, and then we are going to ask why it took a laboratory 23,000 years to catch up with a story that was never actually lost. Subscribe to the Historia Archive and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This channel exists for exactly this kind of collision, when a discovery buried in sediment for millennia turns out to confirm something a people had been saying all along, and there is another one of these waiting for you right after this. The lake that is now a desert. To understand what was found at White Sands, you first have to unlearn what the place looks like today. White Sands National Park is one of the starkest landscapes in North America, an ocean of blinding gypsum dunes in the Tularosa Basin, a place that looks less like anywhere on Earth, and more like the setting of a film about somewhere else entirely. It is brutal, dry, and almost entirely without shade. But 23,000 years ago, that basin held something completely different. It held a lake. Geologists call it Lake Otero, and during the last ice age it was a real, substantial body of water, fed by wetter, colder conditions than the region has known since. Around its shrinking shoreline lay damp mudflats, seasonal wetlands, and grasslands thick enough to support herds of grazing animals. This was not a desert waiting to be crossed. This was a watering hole at the edge of a cooling world, the kind of place that draws in everything hungry and everything thirsty for 100 miles around, and where animals gather, people follow. As the lake slowly dried and refilled across the centuries with the rhythm of the seasons, layer after layer of fine mud was laid down along its margins. Anyone who walked across that mud while it was still soft left a print. Anyone who walked across it after the surface had dried into a thin crust and then been buried by the next layer left something more durable, an impression sealed inside the earth like a photograph nobody knew had been taken. Over thousands of years, these layers stacked on top of each other, sediment over sediment, each one a sealed page in a diary that nobody was writing on purpose. Wind and gypsum eventually turned the whole basin into desert, and the ancient lakebed sank below the surface, invisible, doing nothing but waiting. The first modern signs that something extraordinary was preserved there had actually surfaced decades earlier, but it took until 2009 for researchers to properly recognize the scale of what they were looking at, and years more of careful excavation after that to expose entire trackways rather than isolated marks. What they eventually uncovered was not 1 or 2 curiosities. It was one of the largest concentrations of Ice Age human and animal footprints found anywhere on the planet, an entire slice of a vanished world frozen mid-motion, mammoth tracks, dire wolf tracks, giant ground sloth tracks, camel tracks, from a species of camel that used to live in North America before it went extinct, and running through and across and beside all of them, unmistakably, human tracks. The ground at White Sands had done something almost no other place on the continent had managed. It had kept a record of an ordinary day, or rather thousands of ordinary days, stacked one on top of the last from a period of history most textbooks insisted had no human witnesses on this continent at all. The line nobody was supposed to cross to understand why a set of footprints could cause this much disruption. You need to understand the theory they were about to break. For most of the 20th century, the accepted explanation for how humans reached the Americas centered on a culture called Clovis, named for distinctive stone spear points first found near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. The Clovis first model held that the earliest people entered North America by crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia, then moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between retreating glaciers roughly 13,000 years ago. Before that corridor opened, the theory went, the way south was sealed by ice, and therefore no one could have been living anywhere in the Americas. It was a tidy story. It had a clear starting gate, a clear route, and for decades it was treated less like a working hypothesis and more like a boundary line that any competing claim had to clear before it would even be taken seriously. Sites that suggested older occupation were routinely picked apart, their dating methods questioned, their stratigraphy doubted, their excavators occasionally mocked. The default assumption in the field was that anyone claiming a pre-Clovis date was almost certainly wrong, and the burden of proof sat entirely on their shoulders. Over time, that skepticism was not unreasonable. Genuinely bad dates and contaminated sites did exist, and archaeology as a discipline has a real obligation to be rigorous before rewriting the human timeline of an entire hemisphere. But the effect of the Clovis first consensus went beyond good scientific caution. It became, in practice, a hard ceiling on how old anyone was allowed to say indigenous presence in the Americas could be, and for 100 years, evidence that pushed against that ceiling had to fight for a hearing it was rarely given. By the early 2000s, cracks had already been forming. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile had produced credible dates older than the Clovis corridor should have allowed, and a slow, grinding, decades-long argument had begun chipping at the wall. But cracks are not the same as collapse. What archaeology needed was not one more disputed site with an uncertain date. It needed something almost impossible to argue with, a form of evidence so direct that questioning it meant questioning the very ground itself. Footprints are about as direct as evidence gets. A stone tool can theoretically wash into an older layer. A footprint cannot. A print pressed into wet mud is a record of one specific foot touching one specific piece of ground on one specific day, and if you can reliably date the layer that print sits in, you have dated a human being standing in that exact spot, not an artifact that might have traveled there by accident. That is what made White Sands different from every disputed pre-Clovis claim that came before it. This was not a debate about whether a stone chip could have shifted position underground. This was a woman's stride, a child's small footprint beside a toddler's, a hunter tracking a giant sloth, sealed inside a wall of time that had a number attached to it. The pushback that almost won when the original 2021 paper appeared, led by geologist Matthew Bennett of Bournemouth University. The response from the archaeological community was immediate, and it was not universal celebration. The dating relied on radiocarbon testing of tiny seeds from an aquatic plant called Rupia cirrhosa, ditchgrass, found in the same sediment layers as the footprints. Seeds are organic material, and radiocarbon dating organic material is a well-established, trusted method. So on the surface, the approach looked solid. But within a year, skeptics raised a serious, technically sound objection. Aquatic plants like Rupia can absorb carbon dissolved in the water around them, and if that water contains old carbon leached from ancient limestone or other geological sources, the plant's tissue can test as significantly older than it actually is. This is a known problem in radiocarbon science, called a hard water or reservoir effect, and it is exactly the kind of flaw that had sunk other pre-Clovis claims before. Critics proposed that if you corrected for this reservoir effect, the true age of the footprints might drop to somewhere between 13,500 and 15,500 years, a range that, while still impressively old, would have quietly folded the discovery back into a timeline archaeology was already comfortable with. For a while, that is exactly where the story sat, an exciting headline shadowed by a plausible technical rebuttal, the kind of dispute that in the past had been enough to bury a pre-Clovis claim for a generation. If you're the kind of person who wants to know how a scientific fight like that actually gets settled, stay with me, because the next chapter of this is where the case either falls apart or becomes undeniable. And there is another investigation exactly like it waiting for you the moment we finish. Two clocks that owed each other nothing. The only way to answer a challenge like the reservoir effect is to date the same footprints using a method that has nothing to do with water, nothing to do with aquatic plants, and nothing to do with the first technique at all. If two completely independent clocks land on the same number, the coincidence explanation stops being credible. That is exactly what a follow-up team, including researchers from the United States Geological Survey, set out to do, and in October of 2023, they published their results, again in the journal Science. Their first method was radiocarbon dating conifer pollen, tiny grains shed by land-based trees growing near the ancient lakeshore, not aquatic plants drawing carbon from questionable water. Land plant pollen does not suffer from the hard water problem at all, which made it a clean, independent check on the original seed dates. Their second method left carbon dating behind entirely. They used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time individual quartz grains in the sediment were exposed to sunlight. Every grain of quartz buried in the ground is quietly accumulating a tiny amount of trapped energy from natural background radiation, and that energy resets to zero the moment the grain is exposed to light and then gets buried again. By carefully measuring how much energy had rebuilt inside quartz grains taken directly from the footprint layers, the team could calculate, independently of any organic material whatsoever, how long ago that sediment was last exposed to open air. Two techniques, two completely different physical processes, one measuring the decay of carbon in a tree's pollen, the other measuring trapped radiation inside a mineral. Neither method could have been contaminated by the same flaw, because neither method touched the same kind of material at all. When the results came in, both landed squarely inside the original 21,000 to 23,000 year window. The reservoir effect explanation, the one plausible escape hatch that could have folded this discovery back into the old, comfortable timeline, had just been closed by two independent doors slamming shut on it at once. It is worth sitting with what that actually means, because it is easy to let a phrase like optically stimulated luminescence slide past without registering the weight of it. This was not one lab defending its own earlier work with a second look at the same evidence. This was a different material, tested with a different instrument, built on a different branch of physics entirely, brought in specifically because the first method had been challenged on a technical point that a second method could not possibly share. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of an unstable isotope of carbon, absorbed by something that was once alive. Luminescence dating measures the buildup of trapped electrons in a crystal lattice that was never alive at all. For both of them to converge on the same 22,000-year range by coincidence would require an extraordinary run of bad luck across two unrelated scientific disciplines. Archaeology rarely gets a moment this clean. Most sites leave you arguing forever over a handful of disputed centuries. White sands, after 14 years of excavation and 2 rounds of dating using 3 separate techniques, left almost nowhere left to argue from. The hunter, the toddler, and the mammoth who didn't care once. The age of the footprints was locked down. The far more human part of the story could finally be told properly. Because these are not abstract data points. They are the last physical trace of specific people on a specific afternoon roughly 22,000 years ago. One trackway shows an adult, likely a woman or an adolescent, walking with a very young child for well over a mile along the old shoreline. At points, the smaller prints simply vanish, and the adult's stride shortens and deepens slightly, the signature of extra weight being carried. Then the small prints reappear, meaning the child was set back down, walked for a while on its own, and was picked up again. The adult made the same round-trip journey twice, once heading out and once returning, apparently leaving the toddler behind at the far end before making the return leg alone, which suggests something researchers had not expected from this period at all, that the group was not simply wandering, but had an established camp, a fixed point people traveled to and from and returned home to. Somewhere between the outbound and return legs of that walk, something else crossed the same stretch of mud, a mammoth. Its enormous prints cut directly across the human trackway, and here is the detail that stops people cold when they hear it for the first time. The mammoth's stride shows no deviation, no hesitation, no sign of alarm at the presence of these two-legged creatures who had so recently passed through. It walked straight across, unbothered, as though a person and a child crossing its path meant nothing at all. In a completely different part of the site, another trackway tells an even more dramatic story. A set of human footprints tracks alongside the print of a giant ground sloth, an animal that on its hind legs could stand taller than a grown man and was armed with claws capable of disemboweling a predator. The sloth's tracks show it spinning, pivoting sharply, in a pattern researchers interpret as evasive or defensive behavior, consistent with an animal that has just realized it is being stalked. There is no evidence the hunt succeeded. We do not know if that particular sloth got away or did not. But what survives is the oldest direct physical evidence anywhere in the Americas of a human being deliberately pursuing one of the giant animals of the Ice Age, preserved not as a spear point left behind after the fact, but as the actual motion of the encounter itself, footprint by footprint, frozen mid-chase. Stop and consider what that means for the picture of North America 22,000 years ago. This was not an empty wilderness gradually filling up with the first cautious human arrivals. This was already a lived-in world. There were mothers making round trips with toddlers to established camps. There were hunters skilled enough to stalk an animal that could kill them in seconds. There were mammoths so accustomed to sharing the landscape with people that one barely broke stride crossing their path. None of that reads like a species new to the continent, testing the water at its furthest edge. It reads like people who had been there long enough to know the animals, know the land, know exactly how far a toddler could walk before needing to be carried again. The people who never said they arrived. Here is where the science and the memory finally meet, and where the story stops being only about footprints and starts being about who gets believed. For well over a century, the dominant framework in American archaeology assumed, often without saying so directly, that indigenous nations arrived in the Americas relatively recently, and that anything a nation's own tradition said about being present since the deepest reaches of memory was myth rather than history, poetry rather than a claim worth investigating. Zuni oral tradition, recorded in extraordinary depth by the ethnographer Frank Hamilton Cushing, who lived among the Zuni for years in the 1880s, and was formally initiated into one of their religious societies, describes an origin and a migration stretching back to the very beginning of the present world, a journey so long that some versions describe it unfolding across centuries, generation guiding generation across a landscape the people already understood intimately before they ever reached Halona Itiwana, the middle place where the Zuni, the Shiwi, still live today. It is worth being precise here rather than overreaching. White Sands itself sits in the Tularosa Basin, land historically associated most directly with other southwestern nations, and it would be dishonest to claim the footprints are a literal Zuni family record. But the deeper claim underneath the Zuni tradition, and underneath dozens of other indigenous traditions across this hemisphere, is not really about one specific trail. It is the claim that these are not newcomer peoples on this continent. It is the claim of having been here since time immemorial, a phrase used so often in tribal testimony and legal filings that outsiders sometimes stop hearing what it actually asserts, which is a depth of continuous presence that a rigid 13,000-year Clovis ceiling was never built to accommodate in the first place. That is the quiet, uncomfortable part of this discovery. It is not that indigenous nations needed White Sands to know how long they had been here. It is that mainstream science for 100 years needed something as undeniable as a fossilized footprint sealed by two independent dating methods before it was willing to seriously entertain a timeline several nations had been describing all along in their own words. The footprints did not teach the Zuni or the many other nations whose traditions speak of ancient, deep-rooted presence on this land anything new about their own history. What the footprints did was force a discipline that had spent a century setting the terms of what counted as proof to finally produce proof on its own terms for a claim it had been slow and at times outright dismissive to take seriously when it only had memory behind it. If a discovery that quietly rewrote how long people have called this continent home is the kind of history that keeps you watching, take a second and subscribe now, because there is a lot more of exactly this waiting in this channel, and I do not want you to miss where it goes next. What 22,000 years looks like, it helps to put 22,000 years into some kind of scale, because the number is easy to say and genuinely difficult to feel. Agriculture had not been invented anywhere on Earth yet. The pyramids at Giza were roughly 17,000 years in the future. Stonehenge was further away in time from these footprints than Stonehenge is from us today. The last ice age still had thousands of years left to run its course. Glaciers still covered enormous stretches of the northern hemisphere, and the animals crossing that lakeshore, the mammoths, the direwolves, the giant sloths, the ancient camels, would all eventually go extinct, victims of a changing climate, and, very likely, the same hunting pressure the sloth trackway hints at. The woman who carried her child along that shoreline was not living at the dawn of some brief experimental settlement. She was living deep inside a story that had clearly already been underway for a long time, in a world confident enough of its own permanence that people were raising children on established routes, hunting dangerous animals with practiced skill, and sharing the landscape with mammoths who no longer bothered to react to them. Every part of that behavior speaks to familiarity, not arrival. And that is precisely the point where a laboratory finding and an oral tradition, arrived at through completely different means, using completely different kinds of evidence, end up describing the exact same thing: a presence on this continent that goes back far deeper than the 20th century was ever willing to admit. What the ground kept there is something almost merciful about how this particular record survived. Nobody carved these footprints to be remembered. Nobody built a monument out of them, inscribed them with a warning, or set them apart as sacred so that later generations would protect them on purpose. They survived by accident, sealed under layer after layer of a drying lake bed, kept safe for 22,000 years by the same desert that eventually made White Sands look like the last place on Earth anyone could have once walked comfortably beside open water. And when they finally resurfaced, they did not resurface as a story that needed defending. They resurfaced as proof, plain and physical, and dated 3 separate ways, of a depth of human presence on this continent that many indigenous nations had never stopped saying was true. Science did not discover something new at White Sands, so much as it finally caught up, and the fact that it took an accident of geology and 14 years of careful excavation to get there says less about how old the footprints are than it does about how long some claims have to wait before the people making them are believed. Thank you for watching. Do you think there are other places on this continent still holding evidence like this, sealed under the ground and simply waiting for someone to look closely enough? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.